remarkable new book, Tough Enough, which I keep calling Six Tough Women, maybe because I just saw that Edward Albee played 3 Baldwin. The author tells us in her introduction that for years she called the book Tough Broads. Whatever name you prefer, it's an intensely focused, highly original study of Diane Arbus and Hannah Arendt, Joan Didion, Mary McCarthy, Susan Sontag, and Simone Weil, the political radical and Christian mystic and ascetic. Deborah Nelson is chair of English at the University of Chicago, where she has taught since 1996, and after receiving her doctorate at CUNY Graduate Center. Her first book, Pursuing Privacy in Cold War America, from 2001, adroitly brought together legal and political discourses of privacy with the work of confessional poets of the 50s, Robert Lowell, Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, among others. Joining Professor Nelson tonight are 2 respondents, Marco Roth and Laurie Marceau. Professor Marceau is the Doris Murray Stone Professor of Modern Literary and Historical Studies, Professor of Political Science, and affiliated with Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies program, all at Union College in Schenectady. She's published voluminously on feminism, on politics, and on film, most recently a book on Simone de Beauvoir, and is currently writing about Chantal Akerman and other French female directors. Marco Roth is one of the founders of N+1, easily the most successful and influential and distinguished new little magazine to come along in several decades. I don't know if they use that.
Yeah, we were still little.
He remains an editor at the magazine and is the author of an absorbing and compelling memoir, The Scientist, a family romance from Farrar, Straus and Giroux of 2012. And he writes superb book reviews for the London Review of Books, N+1, and other journals. He's currently working on a novel. Tough Enough is, in Tough Enough, Deborah Nelson quotes Elizabeth Hardwick on Sylvia Plath. Hardwick writes, quote, "She has the rarity of being, in her work at least, never a, quote, nice person." And Nelson describes Arbus as photographing, quote, "the reality we normally overlook in an effort to be nice." Empathy for her, this is Nelson on Arbus, empathy for her seems to be a way not to see the other, a form of good intentions that collaborate in making the other invisible. Her 6 brilliant women have various ways of not being nice or unsentimental, as they redefine intellectual rigor and integrity in the second half of the 20th century. The refusal of being nice, in part a way to build an ethical project by seeking alternatives, as Nelson shows, to intimacy, solidarity, and empathy. This refusal is provocative for the simple, very American reason that it is the preserve of men. One major living novelist has built a career on not being nice, indeed has made rudeness not only into a source of stylistic energy, but also a principled, even moral position, the antidote to the condition of, in the novelist's words, quote, "anti-humanity that calls itself nice." Nice. Philip Roth's Nathan Zuckerman repeats the word, letting its horror emerge, and declares, quote, "I don't care if my kid grows up wearing pantyhose, as long as he doesn't turn out nice." Another frightened soul tamed by inhibition. This is from The Anatomy lesson in 1983. 17 years later, in The Human Stain, Roth discovered a more nuanced expression for not being nice. He called it, quote, "being game," and made a woman its embodiment. Being game flowers in extremity. It's an unsentimental alertness to the demands of the moment when survival is at stake and all bets are off. The virtue of gameness for Roth includes dispositions and strategies that, like the virtue of accuracy, according to the philosopher Bernard Williams, the virtue of accuracy is what resists the pleasure principle, resists, that is, self-deception and the gross need to believe the agreeable. In other words, to be game is to be alert to the massive cultural bias towards sentimentality, the customary, to self-congratulation and its various modes of inertia, reflex, and habit. It's the startling and important achievement of Tough Enough to show decisively that what we have always assumed a basic male prerogative, not being nice, is one motive animating a rich, hitherto unsuspected intellectual lineage. This evening we'll begin with Professor Nelson speaking about her book for about 15 minutes, and then the two respondents will speak, and then the audience will be invited to ask questions.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you, Ross, so much for inviting me. Thank you for being here. I have this computer notes here, which is mostly just a prop, and a concession to age. So Ross has described the book, and I will say a little bit about the book. I'm going to talk a little bit about where it comes from, and what I was, some of the things that provoked me into writing it. Ross described it as a book about unsentimentality. It is. It's organized by author in order for me to traverse the whole of their work. I tend to think of writers as writing one big thing over the course of their lifetimes, and you can see their relationship to what's at the center of the book, which are forms of suffering. Not so much change, but adjust and get refined, I suppose, over time. And they each have a very different take. I think Diane Arbus is more interested in helplessness and being okay with failures of agency and how we depict that. I think Hannah Arendt made the provocative decision to embrace heartlessness just as the Holocaust was coming onto the world stage. Not that we hadn't noticed it, but there hadn't been much discussion of it, much less of the atrocities themselves, which then becomes very widely discussed. And by the 80s, as Art Spiegelman said, there's no business like show of business. So there's a lot there, but she was quite out of step with her contemporaries. Mary McCarthy spent a lifetime obsessing about facts and our responsibility to them in the many forms that she worked in. I think Ross has covered Diane Arbus. Simone Weil tried to bring tragedy back as a mechanism for dealing with the social condition in a great variety of ways, not just what would come to be known about the Holocaust, but in factories and elsewhere. But that tragedy was actually a lost art, a lost sensibility, and she tries to use that. So I try to pit that against trauma as a mechanism for thinking about suffering, extreme and ordinary. Susan Sontag was more concerned, I think, about emotional self-management and the conditions under which that could be maintained in late capitalism, not just the barrage, as she discusses in Autography, of things to excite and to distract, but within the careful calibration of a kind of unsentimental disposition towards this excitement. So each of them has a different vocabulary for it, each of them has a different set of provocations to thinking about it, but it's quite consistent over the course of their careers, and I think they thought very well and very deeply about unsentimentality as a practice, as a politics, as an ethics, and as an aesthetics, because there were certain representational demands in order to do this, and so I try to work that out in the prose style, not only when they're thinking about it, but more often when they're not. So I wanted to say a few words about where the book came from. I don't know how other people write books, but my mode of writing books is impractical. And it starts with just a thread that you feel somehow compelled to follow. And so I saw a review in draft of Elizabeth Hardwick's review of Simone Petramont's Weil biography. And I caught in that review something I had never seen in Hardwick's work, which was reverence. And it was reverence for Weil, particularly as a writer, and to somewhat towards her, what she called exemplary abnormality. So she, that reverence struck me, that her appreciation of that And the way she described it struck me as very like an ideal version of Hardwick's prose style. So it gave me some sense of what Hardwick thought she was doing in her writing. And she mentions along the way that in that essay that she was first introduced to Weil by Mary McCarthy's translation of Iliad, a Poem of Force, in Politics magazine in the 40s. And it struck me that McCarthy was a kind of ideal translator for Weil because the structure of their sentences, to me, had quite a bit in common. And I began to wonder if those sentences were that was just habits of style that accidentally had the same sensibility, or whether that sensibility was in some way tied up with the style of writing. I auditioned a great number of potential writers and artists for the book in terms of thinking where in the 20th century this would appear. The first person I looked to was James Baldwin, and I was thinking of Baldwin's essay about Richard Wright from the late 40s when he's just a little whippersnapper in Paris, an unknown guy who writes an essay that Camus publishes, and then is later published in the Partisan Review. And yet, thinking more about Baldwin and reviewing more of his work, it's clear that he felt compelled to use himself as an example. I mean, he was a personal critic in many ways, and he was part of what Toni Morrison called, in what book I can't remember, a kind of pedagogy of suffering that was in her mind unavoidable for Black writers in the Jim Crow era and the Civil Rights era. This was not a historical burden that they could turn away from, and so it made it more difficult to find it among Black writers who felt that burden very seriously. And that burden is taken up, which I think of as making credible and visible the suffering in their ordinary lives as a result of these different structural problems. It's taken up by feminism, later the gay and lesbian movement, and all these other movements. And that was it. So it made me even more convinced that this wasn't just a question of character. It was a question of philosophical intent, aesthetic craft, and least of all personal disposition. Although I'm not discounting personal disposition as part of it. So they took this upon themselves, and they became outliers among groups that would have expected their support. Feminism, obviously. Hannah Arendt was felt to have, by many Jews, to have betrayed the Jews in Eichmann. But I think it was there was a particular philosophy behind it that made those demands. It wasn't flippancy on Arendt's part, but at the time maybe a somewhat inchoate sense of what was to come after the Eichmann trial, because she pursues the question about thinking about suffering quite vigorously for the rest of her life, up until the life of the mind. Some of the baggage that I was carrying with me, baggage is the wrong term, some of the ideas floating around in my head while I was thinking about the book. One was a pair of articles by Wendy Brown and Lauren Berlant on the fantasy of a pain-free world, and that marginalized subjects were buying into if only they could be liberal subjects, they too could be free of pain. And they were trying to explode that fantasy, and that struck me as really compelling as an idea. At the same time, what does that really mean? Like, what is that encounter with suffering? What would it actually cost to do that? So in some ways, the book is an attempt to account that cost. I was a little, I don't know if you can say this in Columbia, but I was a little frustrated with trauma studies in the sense of more or less sucking all the air out of the room in terms of looking at painful subjects. And that it was throwing our sense of scale out of whack. And so there's in some ways an attempt to restore scale by thinking about the ordinariness of suffering, not just its most extraordinary and exemplary examples. The other thing I was thinking about was much more in the academy, although this has become much more conspicuous in the last several years, I was thinking about the devolution of humanities as either a critical skills building. We all learn how to think critically. Humanities are good for us if that couldn't happen anywhere else. Or empathy machines. You read books because they make you identify with other people, and then you feel for them, and you're a better person. And that just struck me as unlikely. Because if I have a 20-year-old for 3 hours a week and make him read a novel, I'm not going to make him an empathic person. There might be empathy already there that's excited or enlarged, but it's not really, I don't think it's not quite a direct line. And I thought it was expecting too much of empathy. As I came to realize over time, I'll argue, is that empathy isn't a word that we use between persons until 1946. It's a strictly aesthetic term until then. 1946, it becomes a term of psychology. And from there, its ascent is really rapid from the 60s till now with its, I forget that geometrical, yes, thank you, asymptotic line into our own moment. And I really felt that empathy had just replaced sympathy. It was really not, it was not a term of thinking, which was where it began, but a term of feeling. And so, cajoling ourselves to be more empathic, I thought, that doesn't seem to have worked very well, so what are some of the alternatives to that? And so this struck me as a possible alternative, or to think that there were alternatives. And I'd say last word, I haven't been tracking myself time-wise, but I'll last few words that I don't think as scholars we talk enough about the actual writing of books. We take for granted that the writing just happens, and I really set out on a project and spent several years working on my writing to write a different kind of prose in an academic book. So what I did Cambridge Companions, because you have to, in 20 pages, write a pretty complex argument for undergraduates who don't know anything or who know very little. And that's all of us, right? If you're working in any kind of interdisciplinary field, you don't know any of the terms of art in that field. And so if you could write for an interdisciplinary audience, you could write for a student. If you write for a student, vice versa, and you could actually write for people in and outside of your field. The people who read Simone Weil are not necessarily reading Joan Didion. We're looking at the photographs of Diane Arbus. So there's a different kind of pressure to make all of them accessible. And we think of accessibility as a bad word, but we don't think of it as a bad word. So I spent a lot of time slowing down the pace of information in the prose, so that somebody new to the subject it could be more welcoming to people new to the subject, or newish to the subject. And I think that actually became a methodology for me, which was an attempt not to think about them, but to think with them. And that sounds kind of goopy, but really trying to work a close range with their thought and with their language, with the shape of the sentences, and I'm reasonably happy with the results. I'm sure I can still slow down more, but it was really important to the project, and it shaped how I actually built the chapters, and imagined how they fit together. And so I just want to throw writing on the table, since I think people here write, and I would be curious what other people think. I think that's all I have to say.
Okay.
In her preface to Men in Dark Times, Hannah Arendt says that her collection of essays is, quote, primarily about persons, how they lived their lives, how they moved in the world, and how they were affected by historical time, end quote. She concedes that these persons might object to being what she calls gathered into a common room, since what they share is, quote, only the age in which their lifespan fell. Deborah Nelson concedes that her women would definitely not appreciate being classed together by gender. But thankfully for us, Nelson is undeterred. She boldly gathers Diane Arbus, Hannah Arendt, Joan Didion, Mary McCarthy, Sontag, and Simone Weil into a common room to share a wonderfully readable, engaging, provocative conversation about their similarities in style and outlook, which she calls unsentimentality. Unsentimentality is, and these are Deborah's words, a concerned attempt to manage feelings so that no one tears up, not the writers, not their subjects, and not their readers. End quote. What Nelson says these women share is a willingness to confront suffering and the reality of the world without sentimentality, without compensation. So one of the many things that I really enjoy in this book is, in addition to being called to grapple with the significance and impact of their shared unsentimental style, I loved considering the real-life connections between these female icons in the 20th century. It's actually rather thrilling to contemplate the synergy sparked by the times these women were actually in the same room, sharing the same intellectual universe of ideas, or encountering and commenting on each other's work. Because of the popularity of Margaret von Trada's 2012 film on Hannah Arendt, many readers will be aware of McCarthy's and Hannah Arendt's important friendship, but we might not be aware that McCarthy was Simone Weil's first English translator, or that McCarthy once quipped to Susan Sontag at a cocktail party, "I hear you are the new me." I love that. Readers may also not know or remember that Diane Arbus's 1972 retrospective of photography at MoMA produced Sontag's book on photography, or that Joan Didion admired McCarthy's work and modeled an essay on her literature of fact. Each of Nelson's chapters, and she's kind of explained that, is a little universe of its own, and the way she brings them together makes the sum much more than its part. I could easily spend my time commenting on the importance of Nelson's challenge to us to explore form, to notice aesthetic practice, and also, no small thing, to identify the misogyny at work when women writers and artists are criticized for being cold, contrary, insensitive, austere, unfeeling, solitary. Descriptions of their work as detached were lobbed as a defect in character, when in fact this attitude, as Nelson proves, was a deliberate style. The unsentimental engagement with suffering that exposes the unreliability of compassionate motives. As Sontag tells us, for example, human misery is too often rendered beautiful. Repeated exposure to misery exhausts any shock to conscience we may initially experience, and a confrontation with suffering renders no reliable ethical response. Nelson argues that in the work of these women, we see a refusal of empathy, a refusal of the illusion of shared suffering, and that this opens up a space for a particular kind of attention to painful reality. In the time I have this evening, though, I want to press upon another thing that these women share, which is their antagonistic relationship to feminism. This fact forces us, I think, to think not only with them, but also against them, about the particular dynamics of political engagement in their work, and what avoiding, so consciously avoiding, attention to emotion and feeling, and rejecting the motivation of feeling for readers can and cannot do. So doing this, I also want to ask whether Nelson thinks it's the function of art or the task of the artist to truthfully represent the world. What theory of representation is at work here, and which sense of reality? So to begin to answer this, Nelson turns to history. She points out that the story we tell ourselves about how we might represent suffering, our own and that of others, in the decades following World War II, was presented as a choice between extremes. She reminds us that this was a time when the scale of suffering was so vast that writers, artists, thinkers were made to grapple with the inadequacy of the formal tools they had to represent it, even as it was ubiquitously visible. Should they choose authenticity or irony, saturation or denial? Nelson tells us that her subjects reject these extreme poles to insist, and these are her words, to insist on an encounter with suffering that is serious, engaged, and often painful, end quote. So one thing that I'll note, though, is that there seems to be an unstated assumption at work, and Deborah can contest what I'm saying here, but there might be an unstated assumption at work that feminist writers chose authenticity and saturation. But this itself, I think, might be a misrepresentation motivated by a disidentification with feminism that animates her reading of feminism's archive. My question is, couldn't we reach for solidarity without sentimentalism? My hesitation of Nelson's admiration of this style, though, on the part of these 6 writers is maybe deeper. I'm troubled by their solitariness, their dogged individuality, their explicit refusal of solidarity to other women, and their refusal to explore feeling as it contributes to the creation of reality and our perspectives on it. These are characteristics and proclivities of their orientation to the world related to their style that are strongly connected to their rejection of feminist politics. The latter fact that Nelson points out but doesn't further explore. Nelson says this, quote, "Collectivity is something that none of these women could abide. They were also, not coincidentally, ambivalent or outright hostile to the feminist movements of their days." End quote. Not because of any internalized misogyny or rejection of the claims of oppression, but because of feminism's, and these are Nelson's words, relationship to emotional expressivity, its foregrounding of psychic pain, its emphasis on collectivity, and its advocacy of utopian projects, end quote. They saw themselves as realists, and they were robustly anti-utopian. Utopianism, very simply, Nelson tells us, quote, violated 2 rules of their creed, that reality must be faced in all its complexity and pain, and that the outcome of any action is unpredictable. But might solitariness, detachment, the refusal of the politics of solidarity and feeling that these 6 women practice be a political misstep if our goal is to enhance freedom and minimize suffering? So Nelson has taken with her subject's insistence that we prize the object of reflection, in other words, the painful reality over our feelings about that object, or which feelings the object of reflection elicits from us in response. But I think we need to be talking too about how other people's feelings affect us, and how those power dynamics create and maintain the feelings of oppressed subjects too, creating and interpreting their suffering for them. So I want to shift our attention to ask how the exploration of feelings about those who suffer, or the feelings of the people who suffer, feelings of disgust, sympathy, detachment, anger, guilt, amongst many other kinds of feelings, can help us see the way feelings constitute and shape us. That there is no reality void of feelings and fantasy, and that the idea of a cold reality is itself a kind of fantasy. Indeed, it's the feelings and fantasies of those in power who shape our reality, who make their fantasies material. Can we risk ignoring feelings as they manifest in the creation of what we often experience as a violent world of cruelty and suffering, or just the ordinariness of suffering? In this book, Male Fantasies, Women, Floods, Bodies, and History, Klaus Stauweleit explores the fantasies of the men of the Freikorps, the paid volunteer armies that triumphed over the German working class, rooting their hatred of communism and the rebellious working class to their dread of women. Rejecting collectivities and utopian projects entails rejecting utopian projects not only of feminists, but also of the Freikorps, of course. But are the fantasies that infuse the Freikorps best challenged by an unsympathetic, disengaged look at the cold, hard reality of suffering, if indeed we can find that? Or should we risk igniting fantasy and feelings to counter oppressive realities and create alternative worlds? This may be a question as much for Nelson's women as for Nelson. I'll talk for the women. Nelson has done so much, and I so appreciate, to illuminate their creation of a singular space and style for thinking. What is left for us, I think, is an invitation to assess the costs and benefits, as it were, of their success. So, as Ross mentioned, I recently wrote a book on Beauvoir's politics, which draws attention to the centrality of feminist politics, to her style and her political thinking. Beauvoir's politics, substantially, methodologically, and aesthetically, is informed by feminism of this same post-war historical period, one that insists we experience freedom and that we can affect freedom's enhancement or diminishment only with and in relationship to others, never solitarily. She also insists that feelings must be explored as part of the configuration of the social, material, and political formation of what we experience as real. Although I would add that she shares the style of Nelson's writers in that she does not make her readers tear up. Beauvoir, I must insist, is no sentimentalist. Hers is a relentless attack on the sentimentality of femininity, but not one that neglects to attend to the power of feelings in our experiences of and response to the material and social world. Her attention to feelings helps us understand that our own seemingly private suffering is not ours alone, but born of social and political circumstances and felt by others too. She describes the world in its ugliness and beauty, doing so with the goal not simply to present it for understanding, but to confront it from a partisan perspective, the perspective of diverse women represented by millions of unassimilable examples. This is motivated by Beauvoir's own feelings of solidarity, and I would say identity as a woman. She begins The Second Sex in 1949 by stating her realization, I am a woman, a category that she previously thought did not affect her world, but then she asks what that designation might possibly mean, how it does affect her world and everyone's world. Extending her solidarity to others marked as women and exploring what that term even means and coming to a conclusion that it is meaningless other than as a male myth, she takes the risk of motivating feelings of affiliation and affirmation of certain experiences, especially experiences and feelings that women are not supposed to feel, such as the lack of maternal affection, diffuse and untargeted frustration, and so on, to appeal to readers and draw them into a universe of emotions, taking the risk of igniting anxiety and anger, but possibly new fantasies and new futures too. But I quickly add here, she is not a utopian. She's an existentialist. She's all too aware of the antinomy of action, the contingency of history, the way the world escapes our best attempts to shape it in our visions. So what Beauvoir forces us to confront, I think, that Nelson's writers allied, is that reality is shaped by male power, infused with male fantasy, and fused by feelings, mostly ugly feelings of anxiety, disgust, fear, and anger. Other feminists, writers, engage this reality too. Reality is shaped by the hierarchy of sexual difference. Drawing on Marx and Freud, for example, Shulamith Firestone's style is anything but detached, but it's also unsentimental. It does not make us tear up. It elicits our anger by helping us see the world in a new way from a collective space, an engaged and partisan forging of solidarity with the world from the perspective of women, and in Firestone's case, children, who suffer. Or we might consider Valerie Solanas in the 1967 Scum Manifesto, The Society for Cutting Up Men, when she solicits shared anger based in a shared exclusion. This is Solanas. The conflict is between scum, dominant, secure, self-confident, nasty, violent, selfish, independent, proud, thrill-seeking, freewheeling, arrogant females who consider themselves fit to rule the universe, who have free will to the limits of this society and are ready to wheel onto something far beyond what it has to offer. And nice, she hates nice too, passive, accepting, cultivating, polite, dignified, subdued, dependent, scared, mindless, insecure, approval-seeking daddy's girls who can't cope with the unknown, who want to hang back with the apes, who feel secure only with Big Daddy standing by, with a big strong man to lean on and with a fat, hairy face in the White House. That's funny. Who are too cowardly to face up to the hideous reality of what a man is, what daddy is, who have cast their lot with the swine, who have adapted themselves to animalism, feel superficially comfortable with it and know no other way of life. This is a different style. It is not an amour mundane, a love of the world, although even love of the world is more than a fantasy than the supposedly anti-sentimental Arendt should be able to support, I think. Solanas does not call us to face the world in the way that Nelson's subjects do, which is to share it, but not face-to-face, not hand-in-hand, unsentimentally taking stock of its complications, ambiguity, and ambivalences. Solanas wants to bring scum women together. Her style, like Firestone's, like Beauvoir's, faces the world in a different way. It shows the infusion of male fantasy in constructing reality and seeks to ignite our shared suffering as shared anger to join in collectivity in solidarity. Firestone says, quote, if there were another word more all-embracing than revolution, we would use it, end quote. Feminists are tough enough too, but they enlist different styles. They explore the motivations of the enemy, and they're willing to call women to battle. I don't think Solanus would say that Arbus, Arendt, Didion, McCarthy, Sontag, and Weil are daddy's girls, but she might wonder about the male company they preferred to keep. In any case, I feel fairly sure that, like me, she would enthusiastically welcome Nelson putting them together in a common room to share each other's company for the space of this book.
On that note, thanks, Ross, for inviting me to Columbia, and thank you, Deborah, for writing this book, which I was telling you earlier in the office. I feel, first of all, you should know I've been brought out of my hermitage in Philadelphia, and most of my communications with people consist of text messaging my daughter, so it's been a while since I've spoken in public. I might just start texting people. I now feel like I should adapt my remarks because I feel like, Lori, what you were saying was, it's so interesting because I felt that, Deborah, your book was being, in fact, was really a wonderful, subtle work of criticism, not just in a stylistic sense of criticism, but also in that you were kind of exploding from the inside some of the contradictions of what we're calling the unsentimental, tough style. And I think that there's also, this reminded me, what you were saying is that there's a distinction between toughness and unsentimentality. And one of the things that keeps happening is that as I was writing about this, I was like, is this tough, or is this sentimental, or is this unsentimentality? Because you do talk about wanting to have an aesthetic of the unsentimental. And yet, toughness is so seductive. And it's more seductive than perhaps just the unsentimental. But what I was telling you is that I felt, how we were reading this, I felt implicated. And since this is an English department setting, that for me, what Deborah did really well is she illuminated what was the structure of feeling, a term I now feel compelled to use only in an English department setting. But that really constituted a lot of the unspoken cultural, intellectual, and even like literal upbringing that I had. I mean, my mother, who nursed my father through 10 years of HIV, uncomplainingly, her view on Joan Didion's year of magical thinking, and Didion in general, she once said to me, she said, Didion's a little hysterical and overwrought, don't you think? And I was like, this is my... And my mother's not she's not somebody who would have thought of herself as tough or unsentimental, but she had this response to Didion. I was like, boy, I really have been imbibed unsentimentality. And this isn't just my upbringing, but it's also a large and unstated and not really thoroughly resolved influence in the founding mission of N+1, the little magazine that I've been associated with since 2004. From the outset, the editors as a collective and individually were committed to challenging the resurgence of sentimentality during the McSweeney's movement in literature in the early 2000s, also the comforting fictions of just war that often went hand in hand with a stance of so-called political realism, the solace of cultural signaling as a replacement for broader action. There was a belief that we could resist simultaneously on all of these fronts through our writing. That is to say, through projecting a style, which we characterized at various points as honesty, saying what you mean, saying the unsayable, but what we mostly practiced according to habits of thinking, editing, and writing that we'd acquired, at least in part, from the writers that Deborah discusses in this book and the male writers that they associated with as part of the Partisan Review, Politics, and Critic crowd. So I want to thank you for writing this because it's made me think a lot about the founding assumptions of the N+1 project and also the way in which that project has foundered and mutated and was probably unsustainable from the beginning in the way that we imagined it. And so really I feel as much a debt kind of as a person who comes out of this book. Which means that what I'm going to say is probably going to come across as partly incoherent, partly defensive, partly invasive, partly because I feel like I've been put in a position where I can't play it cool here. So I'm not going to try. I do want to start off with spending a moment with this amazing cover image. I'll just hold it up. A sort of bit of surface reading. It's a woman's hand holding a lit cigarette with a manual typewriter blurred in the background. This is the perfect image, of course, but perfect because it gestures, and cigarettes always seem to gesture, toward an ambiguity that I took to be central to your argument about modes or styles of toughness, which are also crises or breakdowns of toughness. There's this floating cloud of cultural associations that we have with cigarettes, the noir film, the mid-century liberated woman, the woman who can stand on her own, but always accompanied by a cigarette, that most terrible drug ourselves that we take in solitude, as Benjamin writes. And then there are all of our contemporary associations that we read back into this moment. The warning labels in our heads, they're going to kill you. We're very much beyond the pleasure principle here. We read the cigarette as a kind of displaced death's head or memento mori, but also as the kind of constantly softened image of self-harm, an imperceptible harm that occurs while anesthetizing oneself against harm or just painful feelings, a kind of bar that one places between oneself and the world, a way of keeping one's distance, keeping others at arm's or ash's length, exiting time for the length of a certain number of breaths that do the opposite of breathing, and so pressing the pause button, which is a kind of conservative gesture, not in the sense of standing on the train tracks of history and shouting stop, but just kind of like taking a break. And what I wanted to know is in this image, which you told me later is actually a kind of homage to photographs of this period taken by the
my editor took the photo.
You'll note the typewriters in the background. This isn't an image of somebody actually at work while smoking. It's a smoke break. And although if one does, if you Google the images of Mary McCarthy, they're mostly the images are of like the smoke, the smoker at the desk with the typewriter. So this kind of puts a kind of distance between the smoker and the work, and so it's a great image. And I've never doubted that as a critic Richard Klein asserts that cigarettes are sublime, and that what we have on the cover of this book is a great instance of the mid-20th century post-romantic, yet still romantic enough, sublime. And I found myself wondering whether this is an image of toughness or of vulnerability, or at least of one posing as the other. So there are two ideas in that statement that I want to separate for now. One is this question of the sublime, which we can put aside and maybe get back to later, or maybe not at all. The other is this pairing of the unsentimental and sentimental, as you put it, or toughness and vulnerability, toughness and sensitivity. You have in this book this wonderful reading of a scene or situation between Arendt and McCarthy that's recounted in Carol Brecken's biography, which is like the primal scene in the Arendt-McCarthy friendship. They're standing on a subway platform and agreeing to stop avoiding each other and to become friends, since what they think too much alike, which is what Arendt says to McCarthy. And in your depiction of the scene, and I'm curious how much of this you found in the Brightman and how much of this is your own brilliant extrapolation, and you were writing into this, you imagine them standing side by side, rather than speaking face to face, and looking out at the subway or like down the tunnel, which becomes, in your account, a metaphor or image of history and its horrors heading towards them. But that's also passing them by. They're standing on the platform. They're not going to get hit. They're not going to get on the train in a weird way. But they're just going to have to watch. So I want to know, kind of in passing, the way that you've done this exquisite secularization and reinvigoration of Benjamin's Angel of History, which had become, for me, at least, lost to cliche. So again, I feel like that's great. I've recovered the Angel of History, and it's not called the Angel of History, and you don't allude to it, but somehow, I don't know if it was there, but it's a great secularization of that. So there's also something paradigmatic about this attitude in the sculptural or photographic sense of attitude of two people standing next to each other, possibly speaking to each other, but directing their gaze onto some third thing ahead of them and concentrating their attention there as a form of mediated relationship. And I think that I mean, you say this is paradigmatic of one mode of toughness or tough love, both for other people and for the world. And as I was reading your account of the scene, I found myself wondering how much this is also a mise en scène that exhibits what we expect to find in the literary itself. That there's literature that wants to be the reader's friend, or wants the reader very badly to be its friend. And then there's literature that will stand next to you and help you face the world, or face up to the world as a world. So toughness, in this account, functions as a kind of tough-mindedness, but also always within a kind of sociability, which I think is an important point that you make in order to distinguish the particular kind of distance and withholding and aloofness that you're characterizing here from other more implicitly masculine forms of toughness, as a kind of antisocial or brutalizing tendency, whether in literature or thought or life. And that brings me inevitably to men. I understand why they're not really needed in this book, and why you don't really need them as foils or counterpoints to the individuals you're analyzing here. But insofar as you point in the introduction beyond the frame of the book and toward a larger project, which you call the 20th century history of the unsentimental as an aesthetic category, its rise and perhaps eclipse as the default aesthetic of good writing, I'd like to know where you would put some of the mid-century male contemporaries of the artists and philosophers who are your subjects. Masculine literature of toughness seems to me to be like already a parodic dead end. During the period that you cover in the book, we have Hemingway's suicide, the Genet cult, which Sontag writes about and eviscerates, but also with sympathy. I mean, in some ways, her discussion of Genet is very similar to her discussion of Simone Weil, which is the kind of exemplary sufferer who we the bourgeois love, as because they show us how bourgeois we are, and how we warm our shivering lives with the toughness that we read about. Then there are the antics of Norman Mailer, the cult of cool individual arts, and then in the 80s you have the Carver period of the spare Western male counterpart to Didion. There's this general cult of facts that's kind of wielded as a bludgeon, tending to cynicism, that you get in like Harper's Index and in the sort of editorial cult of Harper's Magazine, and so on and so forth. So in thinking just kind of free associatively about toughness for men, it always seems to devolve into a kind of sadism, masochism, master-slave dyad. It's punishing readers, punishing themselves, playing up to an unfulfillable ideal, the failure of which is equivalent to social or actual death. When you fail as a tough man, that's it. And that seems different from what you call the acceptance of pariah status that you highlight when it comes to tough women. The way that toughness in male writing is always kind of level with pose. But then you have these other novelists like Bellow and Beckett, and Ross mentioned Philip Roth, who would seem to work well within the philosophical, literary, affective complex that you're describing. Bellow, like McCarthy, and associated with Partisan Review. Like her, also a devotee of the fact, or what he calls the actual, of learning to see things as they are, not as we wish them to be, kind of disillusionment as a form, or maybe the truest form of freedom. And Beckett, through silence and repetition, and the impossibility of both the writing and not writing, and the practice of refusal, which has, and also in some ways these are six figures of who practice refusal, which is something that we've written up. But neither of these writers were invested in toughness as self-presentation, crucially. So I wonder if it's the toughness is more interesting, more dialectical, and more generative as a discourse when looking at women writers from this period, or do you want to introduce a sharp distinction between toughness in the service of unsentimentality and what I was thinking of as sentimental toughness, which is male toughness that's nostalgic or narcissistic, or toughness that's an advertisement for itself and the other way. So I was thinking, is this a good distinction to make for continuing the argument beyond the
sure,
book?
yeah.
If you want to talk about that. We could stop there and have other people ask questions, and if people want to bring back the question of the sublime that I had hovering over this, we can bring that back also, but I just want to say so. This is a
Deborah, do you want to respond to anything?
I just don't wanna, I just want other people, I wish we could all just talk, but, yeah, we all get along. So I'll start with Lori just because Lori went first. Well, I guess I would say, I think the description I'm coming up with of feminism is theirs, not mine. And that's not what I teach. I mean, I teach plenty of feminist writers. So, I actually thought of this book from the very early moment as what do these anti-feminists have to offer feminism? So we know the paths. That seems to be a well-established set of ideas about solidarity and collectivity. And I was interested in where we might see complementary possibilities or alternatives to that, because it doesn't always work. And I was hoping to enlarge the bag of tricks, so to speak, available to feminism. And one of the things, so there's two small things I want to say about that. One is, to me, the kind of the need for the sharing of feelings is partly underlies the problem of the unsympathetic victim. So it shouldn't getting your head bashed into a wall always be terrible, whether you're wearing fishnets or not, right? So if you take out the victim and our need to identify with the victim, or in some, like, so that there's certain ways in which our ability to understand harm is troubled and made uncertain by the necessity of having feelings for the victim. I think Arendt is really perceptive in the ways that empathy can fail, that you can, that photographs Sontag, but for her, the witnessing of suffering of your enemy does not produce necessarily empathy, but vengeance. And there are other ways that that vector can work. And the emotions are more complicated than we assume. And my other feeling, and this comes from thinking about the first three, who are the oldest, they and McCarthy and Arendt, is that they're really coming out of the 30s where feeling is on the right. And they are very alarmed about the ability of feeling to bind a group together in solidarity that can overwhelm considerations of justice, let's say. I think we see that now. So that it's not just the left that mobilizes feeling. In fact, I think the much more ominous use of feeling is on the right. So feeling can have binding properties that are also very anxious-making. And in 30s, the discussion of feeling and affect, if they wouldn't have called it that, but was much more with kind of dread at what feeling could produce. And so some of that, I think, is part of my thinking, is that affect studies, for instance, has lost that sense of feeling as a toxic and dangerous glue of solidarity. So because it's not just good feelings of solidarity, there can also be really troubling feelings of solidarity, or the binding of feeling can be very tight and very very ominous. So I was thinking, we've come to accept this as broadly across the political spectrum for many years, many decades, that this is a thing that works. I'm just suggesting maybe it doesn't, and maybe we should think about other ways.
I think it works all too well, though, because that's why I brought the Fry Corps.
Right, it does work. Right. So then in the 40s, I mean, the question of reality, yes, is this truly reality? I think, maybe I should say there's a certain, so I'm very interested in the 40s, and there's a huge discourse in the 40s around this, about some fidelity to concrete reality in the face of the end of the collapse of fascism in Germany, which is the big lie, the use of propaganda on all sides of the war, the kind of saturation of propaganda of the war years, and other things. And so that there's a very broad discourse in the 40s that I think has a long legacy that I'm going to eventually try to write about, around this sense of fidelity and concreteness, but it's not merely an American phenomenon. It's broader than that. So I think there it's maybe more accuracy than mimesis. I mean, so it's like a kind of accurate depiction. It's, you know, for Arendt, it's sharing the world. How can you share the world if you don't have an accurate picture, your accurate picture of it, so that you can weigh your version of its accuracy against someone else, but find in some way that we all have that same table in the picture, and we can move on from there. That to her is essential to politics. If you don't have the table, you don't have anything, right? And so that's the sense I mean it in. Is it actually real? Like, I think you're right. Like, is there any real? If you're not accounting for something, you're missing some huge part of the picture, of course. So, I mean, I had hoped, and you know, the first line of the introduction, I should know this, and I probably do, but I don't want to mangle it since it's really good. The first line is, no, my line, it's Susan Sontag.
We like your lines too.
I think you're allowed to.
I'm actually talking about my epitaph for this. Is to name sensibility, to draw its contours and to recount its history requires deep sympathy modified by revulsion. And so I am very sympathetic, but I also I was really hoping to figure out what you give up in the process. It's not a free lunch. I mean, it's not like you suddenly get this and then all your problems are solved. It's like you're going to have to pay a price. And they paid the price. I think that goes to Mark's question, like, being tough gets you kicked out of the club, not into the club. And I thought a lot about male toughness in the beginning as a kind of sentimental pose. You know, the held back tear. I mean, think of Eve Sedgwick's really great descriptions of male sentimentality, which is like the stiff upper lip and the little tiny tear. And so I think of like Clint Eastwood, I mean, the various macho postures of toughness and unfeelingness that can only be heroic in a male subject. And I think you're right, it's much more anxious among writers. Clint Eastwood is presumably not anxious, but Hemingway is, I mean, all these other writers are. I think you're pointing to a really interesting cast of characters who aren't necessarily posturing, although I would say Roth is a pretty posturing kind of guy. I mean, I'm not sure he's devoid of that. You know, I had forgotten about that episode, the gamesmanship, or to be game.
Oh,
yeah, in Human Stain. So that was really an interesting thing to think about. I guess my sense ultimately was that you could really see the scale when you had the scandal. And since it's just like, find me any male writer who scandalizes by being unfeeling. I can't think of any. And so once you have the scale, then you have once you have the scale shattered by some kind of outrage, then you can, and it also forces a kind of attention and a kind of rumination about some of those choices, because you know there's going to be a price to pay for making them. And so I felt like there's a more self-consciousness.
Gore Vidal's always thought of as icy. Nabokov, they're very detached, cerebral.
I'm not saying that I'm just saying it's not a scandal.
For some people it is.
Yeah.
There's a sense of
people say I'm not going to read Nabokov. He's too
elitist and manipulative.
Well, those.
Well, that's an aristocratic.
Yeah, okay,
I mean,
that's a better word.
I mean, Vidal and Nabokov are both like
right.
mid-century aristocrats.
Right.
So it's written off.
I get where it's.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, you know, the scandal of Lolita is not that he's unfeeling toward the little girl. It's that he's a pedophile, right? Nobody cares about the little girl. There's not a single thing.
But the scandal of a male author creating Lolita, that's still scandalous.
Oh, no, I agree with that, but I don't think it's scandalous because he lacked feeling for Lola. I think it's scandalous because it's about pedophilia and about the attraction to a minor and the celebration of that attraction in the lush description of it.
And the manipulation of the reader
into sympathizing with him. Right, yeah. But I'm not.
That takes a lot of cold.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not saying there aren't cold writers. I'm just saying I don't think that's the heart of the scandal. I don't think that you get people to dismiss Nabokov for his detachment. You do.
Well, I think people who want to dislike Nabokov think of him as have a deficit view.
It's like the extremity that I'm feeling is in Nabokov is just the opposite. And that's not,
Yeah.
that's not okay.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
interesting that, I mean, Nabokov would be interesting because of the Rorty attempt to rehabilitate him as a figure of precisely the kind of
Right, he writes about
liberal
curious
sympathy
people. Right.
consensus that
Right.
seems to be what would be the kind of common sense political alternative that is neither extreme left nor extreme right.
Right.
And then Nabokov has this kind of, the Rorty reading of him is like a kind of exemplary sufferer himself, who never
Right.
speaks of his own suffering, but is always, but the suffering of the Russian emigre always seems, it's a bad place to place your bets.
Yeah.
I mean,
In the Cold War, yeah.
But I think there is that. It might be interesting to look at the Rorty argument because that.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting.
But go ahead, you were.
No, I could, there were any place I could find some sort of recoil from the work because of its feeling of deficits and so anyway, I thought it made their understanding of it just more present, more available for reading than, a kind of more dialectical, more interesting, because it had to be weighed and measured so often, and there was so much attention paid to it in the prose and in Arbus's notes. I mean, she's always writing postcards about this. Sort of, I know I'm doing something bad, but I'm gonna do it, and she wasn't actually just carrying around a bucket of guilt. She just really understood that she was doing something transgressive in that way, and that she was going to do it.
Well, and I think that you could say it's transgressive because of gender norms. So I mean,
Yeah.
males are not suffering the same kind of standards or senses of being cold and unsentimental. Even if people don't like it, that's fine. It doesn't mean they're not men. This means that they weren't
Right,
women.
right.
They weren't
Yeah.
considered female.
Right.
And so, I
Right.
mean, I think that it's kind of simple to think about, think about the difference between women responding to that and what it meant for them and what they share in terms of this unsentimentality that is quite different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's
I was
true.
convinced by your argument, completely.
So I also think it does strike me as, in terms of Marco's question about the broader history in the 20th century of unsentimentality, is that we just take it for granted. We don't ever think about it as a thing, and I think that we could. I mean, that there's much to be said. There's much to be said about that style as a style, as there is sentimentality. Sentimentality is more in your face and more, it occupies more of the public sphere in a way that unsentimentality is more unobtrusive, and partly because it's taken for granted. But there's certainly a way to think about how that came about. Right? What were the motivations, and how did it become fairly quickly so much a default, such an easy way to criticize a piece of work around feeling, and discount it. So you asked about the scene. I have to say I was not consciously thinking about the angel of history, but I just thought of it as the perfect metaphor for what they were doing. That here's the action going on, you're watching it, and yet, as you know, I'm certain they were not facing each other. Right? They're having this difficult conversation about their friendship, but it's poetic license. I don't really know. But it's interesting too, is whether this is what literature itself. I mean, I think, certainly that has been a criticism of some of these writers, is that they're not, that they aren't welcoming to the reader, right? That they aren't actually, Sontag, of course, partly that's her erudition, but partly it's also her sort of aphoristic style, her kind of adamant claim making always. So she's kind of a bully. I think some people perceive her as kind of a bully as a thinker. And certainly this was something Didion aspired to, sort of being a bully. Anyway, there's a million things, but I just think we could all weigh in on these things.
Yeah, why don't we?
Yeah.
Question?
Or comments, thoughts.
Al?
There's this might be kind of tangential to what we've been talking about, but there's a moment at the, I think it's under the Sontag section where you talk about her sense of the aesthetic as being about knowledge rather than beauty, and knowledge through the senses. And that reminded me, first of all, of Jacques Rancière and his concept of the distribution of the sensible.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if that was like any kind of connection that could be made. Sontag is a kind of unacknowledged precursor of Rancière in that, and then maybe also what that idea of the aesthetic might have to do with, what you were saying about something or anti-feminist could offer feminism. Another mode of politics, if that's like a politics of aesthetics.
I think for Sontag the two are very difficult to separate. So I think you could probably read them. You could go both ways. She's not. Her thinking is all of one piece, really, and so I think that's true. I think she's. I think of Against Interpretation as a Linnaean project. Here are a bunch. Here's like a taxonomy. Here's this flower. Here's that flower. Here's that tree shrub, and you're actually creating a kind of taxonomy of culture through the. There's so many of her discoveries in taxonomies of something, and so I think in that way it's quite to me obvious that that's how she sees aesthetics. And then she has that big moment in '73 when she's written Leni Riefenstahl essay where she says, what's beauty anyway, right? So if beauty was of any concern to her before, it's certainly of no concern to her after. And, but at the same time, as Lori pointed out, she's deeply troubled by the aestheticization of everyday life through photographs. So it's not that she's unaware of it, she's just not, it's not necessarily a goal, it's not necessarily, she doesn't think about aesthetics as being about beauty at all. It's really about the knowledge of the senses. So whether that, French theorists, and I probably shouldn't say this either, is like, they are much less original than you think. If you look around at if you just look, so I spent a ton of time thinking about privacy in the 50s and 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then when I thought about Foucault, I'm like, well, everybody and their dog is making this argument. So, this is not exactly, coming out of the blue. I think his historicization of that and his conceptualization of that was so immediately apprehensible because everybody had been thinking about this for a long time. But he had a much broader, deeper, and more nuanced story to tell about that. But it was not a new idea. It's just not. And I think that's probably... Rancière didn't invent, that's a Greek term, right? This is not new, right? It's just he's serving it up in a new dish. I'm not saying it's boring or bad or anything else. I'm just saying there's a whole history of thinking about aesthetics that he draws from. I doubt he's drawing from Sontag, but he might be drawing from the same sources and the same ways of thinking about the aesthetic as Sontag is. So. In general, read around in the period and you'll find that people are capturing something of their moment, and I think that's why books appear when they do.
George?
I want to take the idea of sort of going outside your course to think about what's at stake. My associations, one was Foucault, who's sort of famously unsentimental.
Sure.
And then one might say, And then I was thinking of you saying that you were provoked or stimulated by the articles by Wendy and Lauren Berlant. And I mean, I would describe your book as a post-traumatic stress symptom of toward identity politics, as having been an intensely sentimental and sentimentality that was associated with conformity and policing and so on, victimization and injured wounded attachments and so on, and then a turn and an attraction to Foucault in many cases at the same time as a way out of that, but still actually traumatized in a way that makes it still reactive, which I take to be what Laurie, one interpretation of what Laurie is saying. But the other association I had is with Nietzsche. Democratic theorists, I'm a political theorist, using Nietzsche, who's an anti-democrat, to try to think about, are there resources in Nietzsche? So I saw you as doing something like that, but it wasn't clear to me. I mean, then there are a whole set of problems as to what you then attach to. I kept thinking in your account of these women of Nietzsche's gay science compared to the slave morality.
Right, slave morality, yeah.
So they're resonances that maybe not just our moment there, but forms of argument. And the last association was why you rejected Baldwin, although that his trashing of Richard Wright in everybody's protest novels, pretty unsentimental argument.
Oh, sure. That's why I thought, oh, he's going to be perfect. But then if you think about all the work, I mean, if you think about even Nobody Knows My Name, like, he's not, I would not call him a sentimental writer, but he has to...
He's bearing witness in some way.
Yeah, right, and he's bearing witness to
well, then what if,
various forms of feelings of pain, psychic pain, and he's not talking about, like, physical pain. It's all about psychic pain, and so it just it's trying to produce a kind of identification with that psychic pain. I have no problem with that. It's just that that's the thing.
No.
That's a thing to do, but that's not what they're doing, and what they're actually in some ways working against.
I guess I mean that Ellison
Probably would be the closest thing, yeah.
I would have put him in a parallel and his turn against the Communist Party. I mean, there is something going on in the 40s and 50s, as you say.
Right.
Can I follow up on George's comment quickly? Because you mentioned Baldwin and Wright at the beginning when you talked about how you came to this book, and I was thinking about, everybody's protest novel was, though, a response to Native Son, but Native Son for Wright was a response to his writing of Uncle Tom's Children, which he was very upset with because it made bankers' daughters cry. And he did not want to make anybody cry, ever, and he wanted to distance himself from that form of sentimentality and present the cold, hard facts. So Wright is an interesting character in this universe as well, and Baldwin was worried about the reality that Richard Wright was presenting in Native Son, a reality, I might add, which is infused with white fantasies about black men and white fantasies about black men's desire for white women. So there's a lot going on there, but Wright is an interesting figure if you think about it that way. So, and Ellison too, I think, George, bringing that up is a important consideration. They're different men than Roth and others. They've got different kinds of investments.
Well, Ellison actually did occasion a scandal of coldness when Arnold Rampersad's biography came out. People were shocked at, quote, a selfish, excessively inward, deeply unempathic person.
So there's a follow-up project here.
Yeah, excuse me?
There's a follow-up project. Because I do want to, I will defend the integrity of the choices. I think the choices are perfect. And this is exactly like they speak to each other, and then also because you seem to have this, you zeroed in on these moments of what you call they're actually the crisis of representation. I mean, the moments you discuss are the moments where the style starts to break down.
Right, like with Didion, where all of a sudden it's not working, with Arendt, when she has this one little moment leak out,
and that could be like, I mean, that method could work, I mean, you know, more broadly, but I think also in this case, like, you really do have, like, you found the perfect, you know,
the cracks.
Yeah, you know, I mean, it's like, as a text, this is extremely tight, but, like, I think it's interesting that we're all just like, yeah,
Right,
let's go and, like, have this.
Yeah, but I think that's great. I mean, I love that. I love these kinds of conversations because it does make you think. I mean, first of all, you can't write a book about everybody, but, you know, but the fact that, I didn't mean to say they're the only people doing this, yeah, the Ellison and Wright are really interesting examples. And Beauvoir, I thought a lot about Beauvoir as well.
Did you?
Yeah. Oh my God, this is partly why it took so long to write the book. It's like Beauvoir, Baldwin, Anne Keith, like you got to read everybody's Janet Malcolm or Flannery O'Connor because she was very fascinated by Simone Weil, and she was and Elizabeth Bishop and like oh my God, like the years I spent trying to figure out like. And Patricia Highsmith, and she would be great in a way,
Yes.
but
But your students do.
but she has no moral center, so she's like, she really doesn't. I mean, not in the books. I don't know about a person, but
Like, Janet Malcolm and Patricia Highsmith sort of belong.
you think so?
Yeah, I mean,
Can I ask you about,
Yeah, but anyway, so I wrote down. I can't even tell you. Like my bookshelf's grown with the people that. I mean, I don't necessarily read all of everybody, but I read a lot. If I thought somebody was a good suspect, I would read a lot of their stuff and figure out, like, does this matter in more than maybe one instance? Is this something that they bother, do they ever return to this? Do they ever think about it? And O'Connor, I mean, there's a great, I have a talk that starts with O'Connor, where she talks about the tenderness of the gas chambers. Oh, it's like too good. But it's only like a few pages after that. But it's really interesting.
this will sound ungrateful, but thinking of McCarthy, and also I guess back to one of your early remarks about trying to write a book that would not be simply academic. To me, there was a missed opportunity, but I'm sure deliberate and you have a good reason, about why there was no examination of McCarthy's biography. I mean, there's the intellectual biography of she and Arendt. But when you read McCarthy's biography and a lot of her fiction, certainly the first book, it's overwhelming, the word revulsion that Sontag uses, the coldness with which she conducts her sexual life, which is almost unprecedentedly available to us through very industrious biographers and her own remarks. I wonder why you didn't want to get into the, quote, real life consequences of toughness, which she seems to exemplify.
This is very simple, and this is why this is not Michelle Dean Sharp. It's like women are always reviewed and criticized biographically. Like,
But it wouldn't have to be criticized. It's a dimension.
No, I don't mean I mean criticism, not saying critical things, but I just was not going to go there. I mean, to the extent that I had to set them up in a situation where an event mattered to them and they wrote about it, I mean, that was going to be in there, but I was not going to do biographical criticism. I was not going to do either psychological or biographical criticism because it's like almost policy more than anything else. It's like, and we know there's like multiple biographies of Mary McCarthy, and I just thought she actually had something. This was an absolute preoccupation of hers for more than a decade in her writing. In like everything she wrote touched on this in some way. This relationship between writing and facts and the responsibility of the intellectual and all these things. And so I thought that could kind of stand on its own. It's a body of thinking. you certainly could go back now to think about the relationship between personal events or personal relationships and some of what she was working on, but McCarthy's biographical enough in her own writing.
Right, you could have handled it
Yeah,
strictly
through
through.
that. Right.
Did you understand then that in banning biography you were basically confining yourself to an academic audience?
Yeah.
So that was part of the deal.
Well, I'm an academic. I don't know how to write a trade book. I mean, I wasn't thinking about writing it. I wasn't really thinking about writing it.
Well, you said
No, I want to write for students, right?
Okay,
Like,
I see.
they're a proxy for a wider audience, but like, who besides the students is going to slog through my account of
I see.
Gideon's?
Mhm.
Use of
Sorry.
litotes. I didn't use that word. But, you know.
Yeah, don't say nothing.
Don't say nothing.
About,
Or nothing.
about to ask you.
Oh,
Right, because it occurs to me with respect to Ross's question about why you leave out the life story, you know, your first book is about confessional poetry.
as a form of privacy.
Well, yes.
Yes.
It's also about women who are, and some men, who are telling everything about themselves.
Right.
And that is their form of ethical engagement with the world. Could you just say a little bit about, don't say nothing.
Nothing between the two
About what
books.
the two books are.
No, I think on the surface they have nothing in common because they're not like there's literally not one scrap of usefulness in the first book and the second book. But in terms of my brain, yes, of course. I really did. That book is a book about privacy that talks about confessional poetry. I don't really talk about their lives in that book. I do not talk about Sexton's lives or Robert Lowell's lives.
Well, but it comes.
I mean,
Part of the
inevitably,
material is
I
there.
mean,
The
inevitably,
sex-
right? You can't,
talk about sex,
right,
you don't talk about it.
right. But I don't talk about her mother, her daughter Linda. I don't get. But so yeah, I would say that's just a broader allergy in my thinking. To, like, it's just taking a very contrary position with regard to confession and confessional and biographical elements and personal elements out of the picture. Yes, that is consistent between the two.
It's really two approaches to, I can say, like, the ethical implications of protecting your privacy.
Privacy is nothing more than the control of information about you. It's nothing else, right? So yes, in that respect, yes. There's no privacy exists except for that control, to the extent that that even exists. Right? That's what the whole battle is in that first book. It's like, who gets to say stuff about you? Right? You. Even if other people hate it and find it disgusting and revolting. But so I sort of abided by, like, Sontag hated biographical criticism and so I was really torn because when the journals came out, I was like, oh, damn, what am I going to do with these journals? I was helping, or I was advising Nancy Cates on her Sontag documentary at the time, and so she knew way more than I did, so then I had all this other information about her. But I just decided, otherwise it becomes the journals are now answering all the questions we have rather than saying, actually Sontag tried to answer those questions. She tried to tell us already what she thought about these things. It's not that the journal, and then the journals are not more real. She said, my books are not me, they're better than me, or something like that. And that's just obviously true. She was not nice. She was like a really horrible person in a lot of ways. But I just don't care. Also, I don't even want to have to account for their niceness or not niceness in their life. Yeah, they were nice. Who gives a crap? I mean, it's just not important. As like they gave something to the world, that's what we have of them, and we should use that. And it's just so anyway. And I'm not a good biographer.
Maybe this is partly answered by the biographical point, but it seems like all of your subjects can be described as sort of ascetic in some way. Like, I don't know if you agree with that or not, but in the case of Vey, it's like a very,
well, that's very
it's a very
conspicuous part
literal,
of her, yeah.
Like if they can have like a kind of like style, if they all have like a kind of stylistic asceticism, in Vey it's very it's literal, like she, I mean,
Right,
I
she was
can
an
tell you.
ascetic, yeah.
Yeah, so how did that, was that something you had to account for?
To the extent that you can learn anything from suffering, it's through asceticism, right? Or these Foucauldian disciplines of the self, right? You don't, I mean, for really personal reasons, I mean, in my own life, I just don't believe suffering. I don't believe in reductive suffering. I don't believe suffering redeems. And so I think that if you want to learn from it, it has to be a practice, a self-conscious ascetic practice. And certainly Weil was not actually trying to learn from her own suffering. She was just trying to suffer in her own life. But, and there's endless, I mean, she's another one of these, like, the reams that have been written about Simone Weil's masochism. It's just like, I'm just going to go there. It's like, maybe she was, maybe she wasn't, but she had something. She was trying to talk about a particular form of attention and a certain form of justice that did not rely on liking victims, right? Like the afflicted are repulsive to themselves and others, and yet you still are obligated to them, right? And so, like, that was more interesting to me. What forms of attention can you pay to those things? That's a discipline too, and it actually probably is an asceticism. It's not comfortable, it's painful, it's self-annihilating for her in many ways. Yes?
Yeah, so I've been thinking a lot about villainous women in literature as of late, especially like constantly reading Morrison. I think about it a lot. And also the other day, and forgive the reference, I was watching The Dark Knight, Batman, and in it, Alfred says, some men just want to watch the world burn, and I think that it's interesting because, like, men want to watch the world burn, this sort of gendering of hopelessness, and it seems like hope is in some way gendered, and I think about unsentimentality and how hope plays into that definition, and I wonder if part of the refusal of these women, or them being viewed by popular culture and society as betraying their people or betraying themselves, is because hope is viewed in some ways as a gendered idea, and women
Gendered as female?
Yeah, as something that, like, even when you think about now, like how people think about like the hope of this country, like even when people talk about Alabama and like black women voting, it's like the hope, of this country.
Right?
Yeah, it's like lies in women, and so the refusal of that idea that women carry hope, how that plays into your ideas of sentimentality and these characters.
That is really interesting, and I have never thought about that. But
think about it.
No. I mean, I guess to the extent that hope is conflated with utopianism, then I would say yes. That they did reject that. Yes, absolutely. So I would say that to the extent that those things, and I think at different moments in history, they are more and less wedded together. Certainly, coming out of the war, there's firm resistance across the board, not just among them, in forms of utopia, because they associate that with Nazism and with Russia. So, but I wonder if that's a more, I really have to think about that. I wonder if hope detached from utopianism is a more contemporary phenomenon. But I don't know. So you're seeing it earlier. You're seeing it in what period are you studying?
Well, it's something that I've just been thinking about actually in fiction and kind of this idea of fantasy, because like I'm constantly like rereading in my mind Sula, which is like a villain essentially,
right?
A villainous character, and her sense of hopelessness or lack of regard for other people's hope, is something that's carried throughout.
And that's part of her villainy.
Yeah. And people hate that about her because she's a woman who has no regard for the future.
Right.
Yeah.
And that if that were.
And Arendt is one of those people that also associated, because of the Holocaust, is like, the betrayal is, I think, in a sense of like, that coldness is also viewed for a lack of want for the future.
You know what I was thinking
super
of?
invested in future. Right?
Yeah, absolutely,
The whole thing, yeah. Good.
I Butler.
Right.
Because,
Yeah.
you know, Afrofuturism is just a thinking of ourselves, thinking of Black people into the future, right? And so Octavia Butler has women who are not sentimental or sentimentalists or in any sense of the word. And I'm not sure about the question of hope works since you're thinking about the future, but there's an investment in the future that is one that carries it forward in a different kind of way, you know. So like Morrison, but a little bit different.
Yeah, but I think too, at least as I'm thinking about it right now, there's something about the time horizon here that is important, so that Arendt for sure. Arendt is all about the process now, right? Because of that sense of uncertainty about, but that the work you do on the process is what's filled with hope. Making the process work is a hopeful thing to do, because it, you know, she says the two most important things are promises and forgiveness, right? So that promises are what make the future possible. And so if you're, but it's very, but the decision making and the ethical, political, and moral decision making has to be based on the situation now, because you don't know what its outcome will be. So she doesn't know, she is not imagining a future. She's imagining a process that will ensure that we have that, right? So that would be very different than, and so I would say some tangible expectation about the future, if that's part of the hope, even if it's not utopia, I think you could probably lop that off. That there's hope in some, that there's a justice to be had in the here and now, and that justice enables a future that we can live with. And so I think that would be fairly consistent. Yeah.
The Václav Havel quote speaks to that. He says, hope is not the same thing as optimism.
Mm-hmm.
Hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well. Rather, it's the certainty that something makes sense no matter how it turns out.
Right, right. And that this is a perfect way of encapsulating it. Yeah, I think that's really right.
George.
So my question that really is, I understand your suspicion of biography, and so I saw your book as essentially aesthetic in the sense, both of a sense of a kind of practice of life, and in some, this is my question,
right.
something about, I mean, you would normally say aesthetics and factuality have some kind of tension between them.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is how do you describe their forms of representation as an aesthetic that nevertheless, what do you say, tells the truth, makes the truth visible, makes it available to us in some way? So it's not like Dragnet, exactly.
No, and there's no idea that the facts are just there, and if you just plunk them on a page, that's going to be fine, right? No, I mean, Didion's all about rhythm. Like, no rhythm, no nothing, right?
Okay,
you do not get to anything close to a concrete sense of a scene, let's say, without rhythm, right? For her, I mean, that's the whole, her issues are syntax, not, not diction, right? Is that you can, it's that the sentence itself has a kind of truth mechanism in it in a certain way. I mean, she has certain rules about it, like qualifying phrases and all these other things. But there's a certain kind of drive and directness in the sentence that refuses to blunt the impact of the scene, right? But it's all about rhythm. So yeah, but it wouldn't be the same for Simone Weil is more like balance, right? And Arendt's trickier because, she was writing in English and she's had to have McCarthy English, as she said, her work. Or she did say, McCarthy said. But you have the same, for her too, it's the same, there still is rhythm and drive in the prose. both her argumentative prose and her narrative prose, like in Eichmann. So yeah, there still are a bunch of aesthetic elements that make something feel real.
And Arbus with the gap.
Yeah, sure.
You know,
absolutely,
the use
yeah.
of the camera
Right.
to capture reality, but how does she do that?
Right.
And
it turns out
the many, many
right.
photos that she took in order to find what was the real, or
Right,
what
right.
did it capture.
When did it really happen?
Yes,
yeah.
when did it happen? Which is so much like Sontag, and
Yeah.
thinking about the, not Sontag, Didion, and
Right.
thinking about the repetition of words.
Right.
And, you know,
Right. Yeah. Actually, it's true. You no doubt don't know how difficult it is to get the Arbus estate to let you reprint photographs. It is like basically impossible. And so I don't know whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, but June Arbus, like the chapter, made no substantive changes because she's famous for making you change your argument. She just said like, Jermaine Greer never filed suit, so I'd like change it because I said, so she threatened to sue, whatever. And like 2 other things. And she offered me the contact sheet of the boy with the hand grenade, where you just have to see the contact sheet and you will get it immediately.
You
Why?
described it so well, though. It's like
Well, I had to because I wasn't going to get it. But it was, but it's so perfect when you see it. You're like, any one of these is a good photograph, but that's
Yeah,
a photograph. Yeah. So.
I think you bring that alive.
Oh, well, thank you.
Final question? Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.